All right, here we go. This is a big episode. We need to talk a lot here. We're going to walk away from this at the end with a Declaration of Independence. A colonial power is suddenly now going to be in open revolt against the mother country. And how is that going to happen? And how are we going to get there? And what's going to happen after that? We're about to find out. So in your notes, you need to list this as The British Are Coming Part 2. And this is, again, part of Objective 1.4 if you're following along. You should have done 1.1 through 3 so far, and you should have also mastered the quizzes for those. If you haven't, you do need to make sure you go back and do that. Since King George III continued to ignore the Declaration of Rights, the colonial leaders from all 13 colonies met on May 10th, 1775, in a second Continental Congress. They began to set up their own post office, make treaties with Native Americans, and served as kind of an impromptu governing body. They formed the Continental Army, with the Virginian, George Washington, as its commander. The colonial leaders, who were mostly from Massachusetts, chose a Virginian as commander to make the resistance of the South, resistance of appealing to the South. Colonel William Prescott set up the Massachusetts militias on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, across the harbor from Boston. On June 17, 1775, over 2,000 redcoats marched up the hill. According to legend, the militias were short on ammunition, so Prescott ordered them not to fire until they see the redcoats, until they can see the whites of their eyes. Twice the militias drove back the powerful British army. Although the British eventually forced them off Bunker Hill, the inexperienced colonial armies proved that they wouldn't be easily defeated. A few weeks later, on July 5th, the Second Continental Congress sent King George III one last shot at peace, known as the Olive Branch Petition. They still wanted to be part of England if the king would protect their rights. They urged the king to negotiate on disputed issues with recognition that the colonies should rule themselves on most matters. King George III rejected the petition and instead hired 30,000 German Hessians, or mercenaries, troops to fight with the British. Washington took control of militias and began creating the Continental Army to take back Boston. He came up with a plan to retrieve the weapons from Fort Ticonderoga, which the Vermont militia, known as the Green Mountain Boys, led by Ethan Allen, and the Connecticut militia, led by Benedict Arnold, most famous for his turning traitor and selling information to the British Army later on in the war, had captured from the British earlier. Colonel Henry Knox and his troops hauled heavy cannons from the fort over 300 miles by foot in the middle of winter. The Redcoats, under the command of Sir William Howe, saw the defeat in Boston was inevitable. On March 17, 1776, the British retreated, fleeing north to Canada. In 1776, a recent immigrant from England named Thomas Paine wrote an anonymous pamphlet arguing for democracy and independence, titled Common Sense. Paine blamed King George III personally, not just Parliament. Pretty radical for a time when most countries were ruled by kings, who claimed to have God on their side. Remember the idea of divine right? Common Sense sold hundreds of thousands of copies throughout the colonies, and convinced many to support the idea of independence. On June 7, 1776, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia introduced a resolution in the Second Continental Congress calling the colonies free and independent states. Congress created a committee to draft a Declaration of Independence. That included Benjamin Franklin, who's pictured on the left, John Adams in the center, the same man who had defended the British during the Boston Massacre, and Thomas Jefferson on the right, the picture of the man standing. Jefferson wrote it within 2 weeks, drawing on ideas of John Locke, that ideas of life, liberty, and property. It was meant to explain Lee's resolution. On July 2nd, 1776, Congress unanimously passed Lee's resolution. John Adams actually figured that this would be the date we would come to be known as a national holiday. But actually on July 4th, 1776, the delegates adopted the Declaration of Independence. The United States of America was born, provided the colonists won the war. And so here we are again to my favorite part of the show here, right? It's question time. And why do I need to know this, Mr. Barker? Well, first, the idea of common sense. Right? This book of duh, as I like to call it, the pamphlet that was written by Thomas Paine, it begins to define the idea of the revolution, and it attempted to unite the colonies behind a common goal. Many people were still on the fence at this time about whether or not they should actually stand up for them, or whether or not this really even made sense for their pocketbook or for their livelihood, right? And Thomas Paine does a great job of of stirring that emotion within people, making them feel like, I have to stand up, I have to say something. Why is the Declaration of Independence important? It's really one of the first documents of its kind, because it becomes what's known, in my opinion, as the ultimate breakup letter. It basically tells King George, you're the problem here, not us. And if you want something done, you should have fixed it the first time. And so that's it. That's all you need for the notes for today. Now we're going to talk about the Declaration in class, and so you'll look at that a lot. So don't worry, you're going to get to know that really quickly. But what I want you to know for today is that you can see the chain reaction of events now leading up to the fighting. We've had Lexington and Concord. We've had shots fired, right? We've got the military in place. Now we're going to start talking about the actual revolution itself and some of the major battles. And how does this country of a ragtag group of people who really are figuring this out on the fly, how do they suddenly become their own country? How do they break away from the largest empire in the world? We'll talk about that next time. Until then, I will see you tomorrow. Have a great day, everybody.